Okay, I have 12 noon. So we will go ahead and get going. I see some people signing on saying good afternoon. So good afternoon to you as well. Thank you for joining us for today's COVID-19 virtual event series. Today we are going to be talking about how to sell land. We have a wonderful speaker that's joined us today, Steve Bilicek. Steve is a licensed real estate broker. He is an HAR member, of course. He's also an accredited land consultant and the president of the Texas chapter of the Realtors Land Institute. He has a great presentation to share with us today. If you have questions, type them into the chat. Please note that when you're typing in, you can select for your comment or question to be visible to just the panelists or to panelists and all attendees. So if you'd like everyone to be able to see your question or comment, change it to panelists and all attendees. Also, we do have 3 more of these virtual events scheduled for next week. So make sure you check out har.com/webinars to sign up for the upcoming virtual events. So Steve is going to go through his presentation and we will take some questions towards the end. So again, as we go through, go ahead and ask your questions and we'll make sure Steve gets to hear them at the end. So take it away, Steve. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Christina. First, I'd like to again say thank you to everybody who's agreed to join us today and on this webinar. I appreciate you taking the time out for that. And I also want to thank HR for giving us the opportunity to speak. Always want to start off by being a member of the Realtors Land Institute, and we like to refer to ourselves, our motto is we are the voices of land. And my goal today is to share a few thoughts and ideas that may assist you if you decide to do some marketing in country property or help out a buyer or seller with some land. That's how we titled it, Tips and Thoughts on How to Sell Land. And I like to start off with Mark Twain, always famously once said, buy land, they're not making any more of it. And that's true. As you all know, we've got a limited supply. And but when buying and selling land, there's always some issues that come up and some things that we all have to think about as realtors. Both when we're representing our buyers and sellers, we have to always remember that our buyers and sellers, especially if they're coming from, say, an urban setting, they likely don't know a lot about land. And there's a lot of little issues that you need to address. And some of the high points I'm going to try to touch today are surveys and easements, some maps, and then the need for education, which is what we're doing today. And hopefully that'll all help you in a way that you'll find to be very productive. The first thing I wanted to bring up was surveys. We use surveys in the urban areas for homes and residential purposes. But when you get out in the country, we use surveys, and you have to remember that in Texas, we normally use a meets and bounds legal description. Now, if in the northwest part of the state and into the mountain west states of the United States, we'll have what they call the rectangular survey system. But in Texas, we use the old Spanish system, the meets and bounds legal description. And when you're dealing with rural land, you always need to be sure to ask a lot of questions and communicate with the buyer and even the seller about the land and the survey when you get to that point. And it's important that you ask the right questions. There's a basic boundary survey, and from there you can go all the way up to what's called the ALTA survey, which is very complicated, much more complex survey that it can even include photographs on those type of surveys. And I want to point out the survey that I show here on the slide today on the left. You see how the surveyor has shown some fences. And it looks like a pretty rectangular shaped type track. Looks pretty simple, square. There's the dimensions of the property, and there's some meets and bounds. That's what the calls are on there. And seems like a pretty straightforward deal. Well, if you go to the next photograph, this is where it's important to ask the right questions. When the first survey was done, this is the same 17-acre property that was out in a rural area. And when the first survey was done on the left, they asked for a boundary survey, and that was all they needed. I believe it was a cash transaction, so there was no lender involved. Well, when the second survey was done, when the property resold about 10 years later, the lender and other individuals involved, the title company said, hey, we want a survey. We want all the easements, encroachments, et cetera. And lo and behold, there's a pipeline easement on this property. The property owner didn't even really know it because it was open grass, pasture land. It was actually a hay field. and there were no trees, so there were no lanes cut through the property to depict the path of the survey. I mean, the pipeline. And as you can see on the right, if that pipeline easement would have been shifted a little bit more to the left, it would have been going right to the middle of this property. So when you have a buyer come out to look at a property, you have to understand it's not just what you're seeing visually when you're there. What you have to also understand is you need to ask about things that are not seen, encroachments, easements. Ask them, are the fences in the right spot? Different type things along that line, because you will get some surprises if you don't ask the right questions. Easements is a big part of that. And as I show on here, the Railroad Commission shows that in Texas, we have nearly 500,000 miles of just pipeline easements. When you start adding in utilities, be it power lines and other type water line easements and things that are in the rural areas, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles of easements. So when you get out to a property, ask about easements, ask about access, ask about utilities, and then what you want to do, and we don't practice law as realtors, but we need to ask the right questions that may lead a buyer or seller, especially the buyer, to know these things. And there's different types of easements, such as an easement in gross, or an easement appurtenant, or even a prescriptive easement. See, an easement in gross is it's an easement that follows the property. It transfers with the ownership. I should say the easement appurtenant does. It attaches to the land, it transfers with the land. The easement in gross, a common type of that is a pipeline easement. That's an easement in gross. And because a property has a road leading to it, you want to ask, is it an easement? Is it owned in fee simple? Is it a fee strip? You know, what are the scenarios with that? Because there's many different types of easements. And another type of easement that we sometimes run into, and this is common on farms and ranches, especially of larger properties, you'll see these not all the time, but they do arise as conservation easements, as another example. And a conservation easement is an easement that's put on a property that's used to limit development and to restrict use. And the idea behind that is really a income tax type play, where a wealthy individual could put an easement on the property and then get a tax credit for it. So if you bought a property and you knew it had a conservation easement on it, you need to see that conservation easement document to see what the restrictions are. Because in order to get the tax donation, they had to take away some sort of use and transfer it to a conservation group of some sort. And so you want to see what that document says, because it probably limits where you can build a house, or if you can build a house. They'll even go to the detail of saying how much land can be covered with what they call pervious material, like gravel roads and things. So the point for the whole idea is that when you get to these rural tracts of land, easements and encroachments and those type of things are important. And I wanted to throw out there too, if you're interested in learning more about the easements, Judon Fambro, which is no longer with Texas A&M, but he was at the Real Estate Center, his last name spelled Fambrough, he put out a publication called Easements in Texas. And you can find it on Google online real easy. It's a real good document. It's only about 10 or 12 pages long that will kind of go over and summarize some of the different types of easements. And it'll be an eye-opening read for you to learn, because say like in this picture to the right, there is an easement there, but that one happens to be a petroleum pipeline easement. And those pipeline easements, they can have all kinds of things in them. And the thing about the easement documents too, is that a lot of times they'll tell you what they can put in the pipeline itself. They'll limit what they can put in it. And you want to know about that. You want to read that, especially if a new pipeline comes through. Hey, there's probably some potential for additional income if they want to go along that same corridor. Another thing too, before I get off the topic of easements, is way back in the early days when we started the rural electric cooperative system, we used to have some easements that were called blanket easements. And people were happy to get electricity to their property in rural areas, and the power companies would come out and they'd just take a blanket easement, which was basically an easement that covered the entire property. Those easements were not very desirable to the property owner, but historically there's been some case law and rules done where they can limit those down to a corridor, but you need to know about that. Ask those questions. It's not a real common problem, but it's one of those things that amongst the many different issues, we've got to ask a lot of questions. On this next slide, I want to point out a few survey issues. It goes back to the easements and encroachments. If you look at this survey that I've shown you here, this is an actual survey on a property. You see the number 10? The number 10 that you see on there twice, that shows you that the fence from the neighbors is encroaching on this property about 10 feet. So, and it's been like that for quite a while. And those can be called, they can almost be acquired by a prescriptive easement if it stays there for a long period of time. So when you go out to a property, you want to say, okay, where are the fence lines? But then ask that surveyor, plot those fence lines, you'll know if they're actually on the right boundary line. And if you also notice on the very left where the calls are, there's a long line going up and down next to two parallel lines. That long line is the boundary line of the property, but that's to the middle of the county road. So this property has some gross land area of whatever size, but a portion of it's in the county road. So the net usable land area is actually smaller than what you think it is. And sometimes it's a negotiating tool that says, hey, I'll pay X amount of dollars for a piece of property. I want to base it on the usable land area only. And those are things you want to know about so you can be able to ask that question. And the other thing that's important about that is as you're able to ask those questions, then your customer that you're representing, say if they're buying property, they're like, oh, right, this guy, this agent is definitely bringing value to this process for me because these are things I wouldn't know to even ask. And if the answer to every question is I don't know, then I'm going to start questioning, is this agent actually helping me achieve what I'm trying to do? So those are important to look at, and these represent some issues that you want to take note of. And you notice also on this one, they marked where the water well was, even where the power line pole is. And a lot of times, when I get a property, I'll ask them if they'll do that mark. Sometimes we even ask them to mark where the roads are and where the structures are. And on a 100-acre tract or 500-acre tract, you might be amazed what they can mark out. They'll sometimes even put on the surveys oil and gas production sites, oil and gas old well sites that have been capped and plugged in years ago. Things you would never know because they're probably underneath the surface and don't even see them anymore. So those are some common issues with surveys
Steve,
and encroachment. Yes.
great. Really quick, I'm sorry. I know we said we'd save questions for the end, but we had 4 people ask at the same time. If you could repeat how to find easements in Texas.
Yes, the author of that document is Judon, Judon, Fambrough, Fambrough. And if you look it up on Google, and the title of the article is Easements in Texas, Judon Fambrough, it'll come up. And it's a pretty useful document. You'll find it interesting to read. He's got several other publications over there on that site that he has published over the years through the Real Estate Center of Texas A&M, which is, as you probably all know, is a fantastic source for information. And it's definitely worth adding to your arsenal or your toolbox of data as you go through your life cycle of being a realtor. So that'd be a great source for you.
Great. Thank you so much.
This next slide I have is kind of a list. It's a laundry list of necessary data and information. It's maybe not totally inclusive, but some of these things you're probably already doing if you say you do some residential real estate or real estate on some acreage. But I always thought it'd be good to have a list. And the first thing is, of course, you want to get a title policy. You want to get a title commitment if you can, as early on as possible, and read it. Read Schedules B and C. These are the things that are either exceptions to coverage or things that have to be cured in order to have a closing take place. But more importantly, if you provide that title policy to the surveyor, he'll then list those easements and things that are recorded in that schedules onto the survey itself. And most surveyors are going to request it anyways, but it's always good for you to be asking that question to explain to your buyer or even the seller why you need that. Of course, surveys. I do get people on occasions that will tell me they don't want to get a survey. They don't want to spend the money. And I can understand the desire to be frugal and save money, but I believe surveys are invaluable. You've got to have them, especially on rural land, because there's so many things that are discovered by that survey and the surveyor and the research he does in combination with the title commitment. The next thing on that list is deeds and legal descriptions. What I like to do when I'm dealing with country property or rural land, I like to go to a source online, be it the county clerk's office if available, or there's a group out there called Texas File that do deed records online, and I try to find a deed, a prior deed on that property. Oftentimes when you get the title commitment, they'll send you those documents also. But even when I say take a listing, I don't have a title commitment at that point. I'll try to find that deed so I can look up the legal description and maybe look and see if there's any reservations in the deed that were recorded, such as mineral reservations. And I also have a program called net deed plotter. It's called Indeed. It's a deed plotting program. And I'll actually plot out the deeds, the calls on the meets and bounds legal description, because then that helps me visualize how the property looks. Because what you will find is, although the county appraisal districts will have some maps, they're not always very accurate. Sometimes they can be off quite a bit, and you'll be surprised where little jogs will show up in the boundary lines and things. And if you can plot them or at least get some idea about the legal description. And in a very basic sense, if you had a legal description that had 4 calls, you know it's only got basically 4 sides, and you can kind of get a general idea. But if it has 500 calls, then you know, oh, this property is very irregular in shape in some form or fashion. So deeds, I think, are very important. Next thing is property tax information. We all know this, that we want to get that on all type properties, but then you can find out about things such as ag use exemptions, wildlife exemptions, timber valuation. These are ways to get an exemption off your the assessed value, I mean, on the taxing that's been done to the county appraisal district. And what you also need to check is, in some counties, the minimum acreage required to get an agricultural use exemption may be 10 acres. Some other counties, it may be 20 acres. You want to know that in advance. If a customer is going out and buying a 12-acre tract and they think, well, I'm going to get some of this lower on my taxes because of an ag use exemption, if the appraisal district is not allowing that break point on acreage, you need to find that out in advance. It's good to know. It may not change his mind about buying or selling the property, but you need to be able to know that information. Then we have deed restrictions, which are common all over, but sometimes in rural areas, some folks will put deed restrictions in. Those, I don't want any junk piles. I don't want any mobile homes, all this type of thing. And you want to know about those. Mineral ownership. Minerals can be a big deal in Texas. Oftentimes, a lot of the minerals have already been reserved, but there are some cases where there are some mineral interests still there. And it's good to ask, who has the executive rights? Who has royalty interest? And if a person says, well, I own 50% of the minerals, but you always come back with the question should automatically be, you own 50% of the 100% estate, or do you only own 50% of a 10% estate? Because they may have had several transfers where every time they did a 50% reservation, that when he finally got it, there was only 20% left. So 50% doesn't mean he owns 50% of the total. He owns 50% of whatever the prior person had when they transferred the title to him. And other new issues that are really coming up are water rights and some wind rights, certain parts of the state. We're having groundwater districts, and we're having certain areas where, let's say around San Antonio, where there's a lot of push to get water for some of these urban areas. And I've seen some people reserve water interests for commercial purposes, not necessarily reserving water for potable, say use in your home or et cetera, but you like to know if some rights have been stripped away from the property. And the same thing for wind rights. Yeah, there could be some royalties associated with it, but what does that mean? What does it look like? If there is a wind turbine on your farm or your property, how long does it last? What happens when the wind lease ends? Who takes the structure down, or does it stay there and become my problem? Those kind of things you just want to ask. May not be really a factor in what you're doing, but it would be good to be able to ask those questions. And then, of course, utilities. Sometimes you go along the property and there's a utility line, an electric line along the county road, and say, oh, there's electricity here. And the family says, oh, yeah, I want to buy this 50-acre tract, but I'm going to put my house a mile back into this property. Well, the utility company oftentimes will give you the first pole or maybe even a second pole. But after that, you're going to have to start paying them to extend those utilities onto your property. And that's if it's above ground, it's going to be one cost. And if it's below ground, it's going to be another cost. So that's an expense that some people don't think about. If they're especially coming from an urban area, they've never had to deal with that issue before. And extending utilities can be very expensive. It's a function of terrain and distance and cost. And there can be a lot of anxiety involved with having utilities to where you want them to be. Or you may have to locate your home or your barn dominium or whatever you're trying to do at a different spot. And we talked earlier about easements and encroachments. You know, easements and encroachments are always something you've got to know about, and that goes in part with the surveys and the title policies. But when you're out there, what I always tell people to do is ask the property owner. And another thing you can always do is ask the neighbors. You'd be amazed what you can learn from your neighbors. And they'll say, oh yeah, we've had a dispute about this fence for many years. Or, well, yes, there's an easement going across, or I have an easement across your property going to the one across the other side that I actually own. So you can have people that are crossing the property, accessing their property. And some of those things are not apparent when you're standing there looking at the piece of land. You can't tell who's actually driving that path. So you need to ask those questions. And of course, we always ask about environmental issues. You can get into phase one environmental studies and all that type of thing, but I've found over the years being around farms and ranches, there's always somebody they have a junk pile somewhere. And you always try to ask what that is and where it is if you can find it. There may not be one there, but it tends to be someplace that everybody tends to accumulate their unwanted inventory or whatever they have. So, and then if you got into tracts that were dealing with farming and some of the ranching, there's some USDA and Farm Service Agency type farm programs. There may be some obligations or some things with that you're going to need to know about. Do you need to have it leased to a farmer, or are you going to try to farm it yourself? There may be some eligible income that's associated with those programs that you won't know about until you ask, and of course, ask the landowner. Another item there is drainage. Drainage is always an issue, and we'll talk a little bit later on here about flooding, but you always want to know about drainage. Where does the water go when it rains? Does it stay on my property? Does it go to the pond in the back? Is the land sloping to the front? Is it sloping to the rear? It's just always drainage is an important issue. And when you're doing looking at a property, you're trying to help a customer. We all know we got to have comparable sales data, and we try to get appraisal reports. Sometimes we try to get the prior sales history. There's some sales information available from the appraisal district sometimes, but you need some data to really know, okay, what are these tracts going for? I know they're asking this amount, but what is it really worth? And then you got to take into account differences, as you all know. And that's what the appraisers do for us. But when we're trying to give a buyer the broker's opinion about what we think a property should be listed for or what they should possibly pay, we want to have some basis for how we do that. And there's data out there. It's just a matter of finding it. Another thing that comes up quite often is ownership interest. And you'll find sometimes these rural tracts, there's 3 or 4 owners. It's kids have inherited from their parents. Or I had one not too long ago, and there was 16 owners. And that's very complicated. The person I'd always dealt with seemed to be the lead person. Didn't really mention about anyone else. Started talking to them a little bit more about the property. Next thing you know, there's a bunch of brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts. And it got complicated very quickly. And we have to somehow, if they didn't have a ownership agreement of some sort, we have to get every one of those people to sign those documents, be it for listings or for contracts. And that's definitely where you need an attorney to help you. And it gets really complicated at that point. And again, it always comes back to talking to your neighbors. Are there any neighbor issues? And the neighbors oftentimes will be more than happy to tell you about their problem with Johnny across the fence, or the Johnny's cows, or his dog is always over here, or what's going on. So always talk to the neighbors. When you get out, look at property, I think it's always a good idea if you see someone on the road to introduce yourself. Heck, you might even generate some more business doing that, because oftentimes the neighbors know more about the property. Sometimes if it's absentee owners who have inherited the property, the neighbors are going to know more about it than those owners actually do. So they're good to always ask those questions. And then it goes back to access and road conditions. I had a property that we dealt with not too long ago. It was on the road leading back into it. And then we realized we were crossing to 3 different other owners' properties. So it was on a long access strip easement. And those are things you'd like to know in advance. What is your obligation underneath that easement? Access agreement. Do I have to maintain the road? Does the neighbor maintain the road, or does he just tear it up with his truck and then I have to fix it every time? So those are things you want to know. And in rural property, rural land, it's not uncommon to have some access or reciprocal access agreements with other people and people using the same roads. And of course, as I'm sure you all know in advance, you always want to know about the proximity to amenities in the area. I've had people say, I'll be interested in this property, but this is more than 30 minutes from the nearest H-E-B, Kroger, or Walmart. So, and I don't want to go that far to try to get groceries or get things. So you need to kind of know those things. And if there's any complexities with the road system on getting there, is it all gravel roads? I even had a lady one time that came out, nice person, she had a real nice Cadillac. And she said, well, I can't buy this property because this gravel road is going to nick the paint off on my car. That was a legitimate point. It was important to her, and she'd rather find something that wasn't on a gravel road, that was on a paved road. And one other thing I want to throw out there too, when we're talking about access, when you come out to a piece of land, if you see a road, or if you've got a piece of land, you're going to divide it off, and say it's on an FM highway, or it's a US highway or state highway. Some people don't realize, but you don't automatically have permit to put a driveway in. You might want to talk to the Texas Highway Department and see, do I have to have a permit to have a driveway at this location? Because they have access rules, separation distances between driveways that they require. And those vary based on speed and usage. Most of the time they'll work with you, you can get one, but it's a good question to ask. I had a property recently that the man had multiple driveways, and the one that we used the most common, it was there. We had someone look at the property, came out to look at it one day, and that driveway was literally gone. The highway department had put it in on a temporary basis with a construction project. And during the week that I wasn't around, they had literally come along and taken all those temporary driveways out. So needless to say, that driveway was not permitted. It wasn't tied to the property anyway. So you get some surprises like that in rural areas on occasions. Some of that actually shows up in the urban areas too. The next one here is water. You don't want to always assume that a property has access to water. There's not necessarily a rural water district or a rural water system in these rural areas. And oftentimes properties rely on water wells. In our part of the state, southeast part of Texas, water wells are pretty common, and you can most of the time find water. But I've had properties go further west, they don't have water. It's so deep that it's expensive to get to. And the way to start that is, again, ask the owner. You have a water well. How deep is it? Do you know who drilled it? Do you have a driller's report? You can ask them if they have a driller's report if it's not real old. And if nothing else, too, go find the local water well man who drills water wells in that area. Ask him about it. He'll tell you where he's drilled wells recently. Does he think he can find water on that place? And then, more importantly, what will it cost? Because water wells can be expensive at times. And if there is a groundwater district or a water company, a rural water district of some sort, go see them, visit them. Again, ask the neighbors about water. You'd like to know about volume. Is it a 5-gallon-a-minute well? Is it a 50-gallon-a-minute well? And if so, what can you do with it? What can't you do with it? This well you see here on the right, that was a big irrigation type well on a farm. And you can see there's a lot of volume coming out of there. You probably don't need that much water, but it's great to have water because we all know during a drought, water's great. Of course, during a flood, water can be a little bit of a deterrent, but that's a little different type of water. But we want to know about the rules for drilling water wells. And I think the best way to start is always ask the property owners and then the neighbors. When you come on a property, you'll probably see if there's a water well there or not. Or if there's not, you may ask them, why is there not one there? And the water well drillers, I think, is a great source for always to get information. Another thing we want to do is maps. You can never have enough maps. If we can get aerial maps, we get floodplain maps. We want to get topography maps, soil maps, and even future project maps. This is actually an aerial map showing an area north of Richmond, Roseburg, and Fort Bend County that I just made random, picked an area along the Brazos River. And it's a nice little Google Earth map. But as you know, most of you do, you can use Google Earth. You can zoom down, zoom up. There's a lot of things you can see about a property that you can't really determine or find just by driving up along the road and looking at it. Another thing you want to do, if you can't get the most recent maps, and believe it or not, sometimes it's advantageous to look at older maps too, and you can see what's changed or what's gone. So if you're in an area where the river is, did the river change course over the last 40 years? Just something interesting to know. And or if there's been new subdivisions popping up. Soil maps are sometimes good if you're into farming and agriculture, but they also tell you suitability of the soil for foundations and that type of thing if you're going to build a house out. Another thing too is future project maps. Sometimes there'll be roads planned in these county areas or rural areas. I know some of you may have seen recently, they're trying to build a bullet train from Houston to Dallas. You'd like to know where that route of that train's going to be if it's ever built or not. Those kind of things, although you may be in a very rural area, you think it wouldn't affect you, it could come right through your property. What does that mean? What does that do to you? Does that affect you, your use of your property? It may affect how much you enjoy your property if the train goes by 5 times or 10 times a day. Next slide is that same area, and it shows a floodplain map. Now, we all know from floodplain that here in the Houston area, that water and flooding is a real problem. And we've learned to ask more and more about questions about floodplain. And sometimes you can get the surveyor to plot the floodplain for you on his map if you think it's an area that would be useful to you. Maybe give you an elevation certificate. And that we all know there's three types, basically, in general, there's three areas of floodplain. That's the 500-year floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, and the floodway. And if you're in the floodway, you most likely cannot build anything. They won't allow anything that inhibits water flow in the floodway. On this map you see in front of you, there are some blue lines drawn. Those are base elevation determination marks. Those are useful too. Say, for example, the base elevation on that area was 50, and you got some survey work done, and he gave you an elevation estimate, and he said it was 51. Well, you know you're 1 foot above base flood elevation. But if it was 49, you know you're a foot below base flood elevation. And if you're in a county that requires you to build a slab 18 inches above base flood elevation, you're going to have to come up 2.5 feet on that slab because of that difference there. And flooding is always something we have to ask about, because there's nothing can ruin an experience of buying a piece of property than coming out and it's all underwater one day. This is a picture of that same area that I was just showing y'all, but from the side. And what I want to point out on this was the FEMA map on this area was done originally. The more recent one that I had seen at one time was back in January of 1997. The two white buildings you see there, they're on what's called FM 723. And when the 1997 FEMA map was out, that area showed some floodway, some floodplain, and then it was out of the floodplain to the right. Well, then the new map came out in April, I think it was 2014. All this area showed up in floodplain and floodway. And the people were upset, said, why did y'all change the floodplain map? You're raising our cost, you're changing the use of our property. Well, then Hurricane Harvey came, and look what it did. Those studies and engineering work that they had done it with through the county engineer's office and through FEMA was pretty accurate, because that whole area is underwater. The river's up in the upper part of your picture in the background, and that whole area went underwater. So you want to check those FEMA maps, and then you want to see if you got the most recent FEMA map, and then also ask the county where you're at if the engineers, if they've done any updates to those FEMA maps, and if there's anything pending, because I think in Fort Lee County right now, they're pending a new map coming out. And as there's additional development that occurs, especially downstream, where that water goes and how things occur, it's going to change, and it's going to have an impact on it. In terms of maps, you can never have enough maps. The map on the left is a kind of a good old-fashioned U.S. geological topography map. It shows contour lines and that type of thing. These maps, you can get them in a paper form, or you can have access to them online. But what I wanted to point out here was, if you take some of the same data on the left and you put it on the aerial map to the right with those contour lines overlaid, look how much more you can kind of see about this piece of rural land. You can see how the land's dropping. This is down near the Brazos Bend State Park. And again, I just picked this area at random, but you can see the elevation lines. As you zoom down closer to those lines, they'll get a little more data. There's a variety of mapping sources out there. Of course, you have the appraisal district, which is useful to you. But then there's private companies like TerraStride is the one company. There's another company called MapRight. They produce maps that you can subscribe to, and they have very good maps that have multiple different layers you can turn on and off. And there's even another program, I think it's called Terrain Navigator Pro, just to give you some suggestions on some map companies to look up. I personally use a company called MapRight, but I think they all do a great job. And you can never have enough maps. Maps tell you so much about your property in a rural area, especially when you have of any kind of size, because there's ponds, there's low areas. There could even be some wetland areas that'll show up that you didn't even know were there. And also, you'll see things like roads, you'll see easements, pipelines coming across country, and say, oh, there's something coming across right here. And it'll lead you to start asking those questions, because you're going to need to ask those questions when your customer decides to make that decision if they're going to buy. The next part of what I have here really is kind of getting near the end of my presentation. Actually, I'm a little bit ahead of schedule, but it's in terms of education. You know, part of the being successful in the real estate business, especially in the land business, is knowing as much about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And there's no better tool for that, for success, is to get education from the right organizations. You know, what I would suggest, if you want to help a person buy or sell some country property or buy some land, maybe initially you might want to partner up with an experienced real estate professional and look at rural land from the light of their experience, so they can help you be successful at it. you want to learn as much as you can. I know here at Realtors Land Institute, we offer a whole series of courses. Uh, our very first and basic course is the Land 101 Fundamentals of Land Brokerage. It's kind of the starting point, but we have courses covering a variety of different topics and issues, from site selection to transitional tracts. When you go out to a piece of property and it looks like farmland, but in fact, the highest and best use of that property is a residential subdivision, which explains why they want 10 to 20,000 acre for it versus $2,000 or $3,000 an acre for it. And we even have a course on mapping technology. We now have some recreational land. And I think the most important thing I could offer there is partner up with some people who have the background, the experience that can help you, and educate yourself. There's a lot of tools out there available, be it the maps and different things to be successful. And with those, you can then get to where you want to be. And that's kind of I'm a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's kind of the end of my presentation, and see if we have some questions. Maybe I can answer them.
We do have some questions, and actually one of the first questions that came in was actually about the land designation, and you were just talking about education. So Matt was asking what the requirements are for the designation as far as how much land you have to have sold to get that designation.
You know, Matt, the Realtors Land Institute, in order to get the ALC, the Accredited Land Consultant designation, you're going to take a series of courses. There's 3 or 4 core courses, and there's some additional courses you can also take. And then you're going to have some volume requirements in terms of land transactions. One time it was quite a bit more, but I believe right now it's around $10 million over a certain period of time. And that can easily be done, but they have to be actual land transactions or rural property type transactions where the bulk of the value is in the land. But the ALC, it's one of the thing about it is a series of courses, but you also have a final exam at the end. I think it's a 4 or 5 hour exam that you'll have to take, and it's a challenging exam, but it's worth it. If you've taken the coursework and you've studied, it's easy. You can do it. It's definitely worthwhile achieving it, and hopefully that answers your question a little bit. But if you need more information, I'd love for you to contact me or even our chapter administrator, Kinski Moss, that shows up on our site here. Mm-hmm. And she can give you any information about the classes and upcoming courses.
Great, thank you. Sherry asked if you could give the full name of Fambrock. She couldn't catch it.
Yes, his name is Judon, first name Judon. Be sure I spell his last name correctly here. It's Fambrough. Judon Fambrough. And actually, I see on the publication, I have it in front of me, it's titled Technical Report 422. This is Technical Report 422. It's just one of many sources, but I found it to be pretty useful to get the basics of the easements. Very
good. And I just tried to type it into the chat, and it auto-corrected to change his name to Judos. So make sure you type it in correctly. Okay, so there was another question. Let me make sure I find it here. Where can you search for future projects?
For future land?
Yes. Well, yeah, they were asking about, it was, that question was asked when you were discussing the rail between Houston and Dallas.
Oh, you know, a lot of places to do that is the economic development corporations of each of these rural areas. You know, Fort Meade County has an economic development council, and a lot of times, believe it or not, go to the county judge's office and ask the secretary of the county judge and say, hey, is there anything coming on new or different here? County commissioners, in a lot of the counties, they have precincts, and there'll be a commissioner for the various precincts. And normally there's about 4 precincts in the county. If you find a precinct commissioner that in the area where you're interested in, they'll often know about new projects coming up. And you'll be surprised some of the things that'll arise. Some of you, if you're older like me, you remember used to have the Super Collider plant was up in the north part of the state. And it was a big deal. There was a lot of dispute over it, and it actually was never built. But I think they actually they started and did some right-of-way acquisition, but I don't know if they've never used it. And but those kind of projects do come up. It could be major cross-country transmission lines coming through, or maybe a new pipeline coming from West Texas to the refineries here in the southeast part of the state. So there can be all kinds of things that are going on.
Okay, very good. Good suggestions there. Lou asked, is there a map showing pipelines under the land?
You know, the Texas Railroad Commission has those type maps online free of charge. So look up Railroad Commission. They have some different interactive type maps. And then some of those programs, those companies I spoke of, like such as MapRight, I know on their service, one of the layers that they have available to you is pipelines. And the thing about pipelines too is if you see a pipeline, you'd like to know, one, if you could, how big it is and what they're putting in it. Is it gasoline? Is it oil? You know, what's coming through that line? May or may not be a big issue to you, but it'd be good to know about.
Okay. We had a question. Can we sue neighbors if they build their land up and rainwater comes onto our side in a non-HOA area?
Well, that's probably a question for an attorney. You know, I can't really give legal advice, but oftentimes you'll see disputes arise, and the first thing to always do is go talk to your neighbor if you can, of course. But then if you have to get an attorney and get a legal opinion about that, and that person that might have done some buildup might have had a permit to do that from the county. You don't know. So you got to ask a lot of questions before you spend a lot of money on that one.
Okay, very good. Linda asked if a survey is needed, who should pay for it?
Well, like everything else in real estate, surveys are negotiable. I find historically that it's most common for the seller to pay for a title policy and the buyer to pay for the survey. But sometimes I'll have a seller go ahead and get a survey in advance on their own when they say list a property, because they want to know about these type things. They want to find out for sure, how big is my tract? Where are my boundary lines? Because it's like anything else, in land, you're okay as long as you disclose everything you know. If you got issues or things coming up, sometimes sellers says, look, I like to get a survey just so I can make sure I can tell everybody everything I need to, so I don't have any problems in the future. But if it comes down to writing a contract, oftentimes we'll put in the contract that the buyer will pay for the survey. Sometimes if it gets to be a dispute, we'll say, okay, the seller will pay you 50% of the cost of the survey as a credit at closing. That way, if the buyer doesn't close, they pay 100% of the cost. If the buyer does close, the seller will then chip in a little bit of money at that point because they've actually made it to the closing table.
Okay. Is it common for a seller to have to pay annual taxes on a public easement?
I'm not sure if I understand that question. If it's a public easement, you're going to, I think you're talking about the land area inside the county road. You always want to go to the appraisal district and make whatever protest you can and present those type of issues and things that come up. What I would do, if you can, if there's a portion of the property in the public road, let everybody know your net usable land area is only 5.5 when you may all think it's 6 because some of it's in the county road. And if the county road's along the long length of your property, it could be quite a bit of land in the county road. That's not always going to be a problem, but you will find that issue come up on county roads that sometimes you will be to the center of the road. And you own it, but you really can't use it.
Okay. That looks like all the questions that I have. Steve, did you have any other comments you want to share with our members?
No, I would just tell everyone thank you, and I would appreciate if you would reach out to us at Realtors Land Institute. There's a lot more to land than what I can tell you on this little webinar, but we have a whole variety of courses, and if we have the interest, we'll try to offer a Land 101 course here in the Houston area. So send me an email or send an email.
Yeah, there is interest. They are asking. They want you. Actually, one more question that popped up. Gabrielle asked, can you suggest any land lenders?
Well, most banks will consider a land deal, but what you're going to find is the farm credit system in Texas, be it Capital Farm Credit, Lone Star Ag Credit, or the Farm Credit Bank, or the primary lenders for rural tracts. And even when people and I talk about rural tracts, it's not necessarily 500 acres or 1,000 acres. They'll finance 10 acres, 20 acres, 5 acres, as long as it's primarily used for rural agricultural type use or rural home site. And what you're going to find too, their rates and their terms are very, very competitive. I spoke to one of them this morning, and some of their effective rates on certain packages were less than 4%, going down to the lower 3% range, which is amazing for a piece of land.
Great, thank you. And yes, we will be having some land classes this fall. Those are in the works right now. Actually, Rita just commented there to let everybody know. So be on the lookout on our education site. And again, thank you, Steve. Everybody's thanking you in the comments. Actually, one more here. Does RLI do online classes?
We do have, the National RLI does offer some virtual classes here at the state level, most of our classes have been in person. We found the in-person classes to be much more productive and much you can interact and really have some really good discussion. But we do have there are some virtual classes that are available in the National Realtors Land Institute.
Great, thank you. So thank you again Steve, and thank you again to everybody for joining today's virtual event. We do have more scheduled. We have 3 scheduled for next week, some really great topics. So be sure to check those out, har.com/webinars. Make sure you're signed up. Everybody who attended yesterday's session should have just received the slides and recording of that. So, and then of course, today's session was recorded. We will send you guys the link for that. And Steve has also provided us his slides, so we will share those with you guys as well. So thank you all for joining, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.